Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about Empire of Ivory by Naomi Novik. So we've made it to book 4 in the Temeraire series. In this one we follow Lawrence and Temeraire returning home from their difficult journey from China, only to discover that the reason that none of the other dragons had been sent to help them when they were mired in the war in Europe was because a plague had hit the entire English aviator corps. All the dragons are sick with a respiratory illness. Many are already dead, few can fly, and all of the surviving dragons are in quarantine. Needless to say, everyone is desperate to keep Temeraire and the Ferals healthy and safe, which means keeping them away from all the other dragons in the entire corps. But then disaster strikes, and Temeraire ends up in the center of the quarantine fields, surrounded by sick dragons. And yet he does not get sick. They realize Temeraire might be immune, probably because he had the disease already. You see, on the trip to China, he got briefly ill. He had a brief, what they thought was a cold. But while they were waiting in Cape Town to move back, to get different tides or something, I don't remember why they were waiting in Cape Town, but they waited in Cape Town for a while, and while they were there, his cooks tried him on all these different spices and all these different flavors, and he got better. And of course, this leads them all to suspect that there is a cure to this respiratory illness somewhere in Cape Town. And so they are sent back to Africa with some of the friends to see if they can find this cure and bring it back home. Hopefully before Napoleon realizes exactly how weakened England's defenses currently are. So the main thing I've been following with this entire series is the interplay between historically accurate ways of thinking and modern sensibilities. The last book in the series, the previous one, I felt like didn't quite balance the two ways of thinking quite as well, but this one really worked for me. Lawrence is both charmingly and slightly less charmingly outdated, while also keeping just enough modern sensibilities that we can like him. I talked in previous reviews about how we hadn't seen as much of the "my character is so special because he just magically knows what's right and wrong even when his culture has no idea" trope so much with Lawrence, and yeah, it's still not quite there here. Like, we walk the line pretty well of giving him a reason to understand what's right and wrong, and a lot of that reason is Temeraire. But the important thing is it feels natural. It feels not Mary Sue-ish, but that was exceptionally hard in this book, because this is the book where the discussion of slavery becomes less metaphorical, focusing on the dragons as an imperfect stand-in for enslaved people, and becomes far more literal. There is a lot in this book about the slave trade, the abolitionist movement, and colonialism. It's really the heart of the entire book. And Lawrence is a really interesting protagonist to have in a book that is largely about the abolitionist movement. Because we know from earlier books that Lawrence is pro-abolition. It is one of the few things he has in common with his rather standoffish father. But we get the feeling that Lawrence is very passively abolitionist. Like, he does want the abolition bills to be passed, he does want enslaved people freed, he doesn't want the slave trade to continue. He's even fought with a friend over whether or not enslavement is right, but he's never done anything to push for it. He has not put his neck out there to try to stop the slave trade. And this is the book where he's asked to directly step up and do so. And he does, but only warily. And only because it will help the dragons, and because Temeraire tells him to, basically. Basically, he's backed into a corner. It feels slightly uncomfortable to read, but it's immensely accurate. Like, generally speaking, yes, we want our characters to be the ones deciding to do the right thing. We want our characters to have more agency than that. But if you actually go back and read about the real abolitionist movement, and I will admit, I know far more about the American abolitionist movement than I know about the English abolitionist movement. But we tend to imagine that everyone is in one of two camps. Like, everyone is either aggressively pro-abolition, willing to go out and fight for it. They are warriors for the good cause. Or they're just pure evil people being like, "Oh, I don't care about anyone. Slavery makes me money, so it's good." But the truth of the matter is, there were a lot of people in between those two. There were the slavery apologists who saw it as a necessary evil. There were the ones who acknowledged it was evil and wished it would stop, but didn't think they actually had any power to do anything about it and weren't really willing to try. And then there were those who were willing to step up and say, hey, I'm an abolitionist, I believe this should end, as long as it did not negatively impact them too much. And Lawrence's arc in this book, he really starts out in that last camp and needs to jump ship all the way to actively willing to fight for what is right. He is challenged in this book to actually stand up for what he believes in, first with the support of his commanding officer, and eventually with or without it. And Temeraire continues to basically take the role of his conscience. He is the one who reacts, who points out what is obviously right or wrong, and that Lawrence knows what is right and wrong, and that Lawrence has the power to do something, and therefore he must do something about it. And as stated in previous reviews, I think this is what makes Lawrence's journey feel more accurate, that there is an outside force reminding him of, like, things that are clear to us, but would be less clear to someone born at the time. That, yeah, this is wrong. And yeah, eventually Lawrence realizes that he does have to make sacrifices for the good of others in this case. First he sacrifices his time, then his comfort, then his money, and finally he's asked to do what is right, even if that contradicts what he's ordered to do, and if he has to sacrifice everything to do it. And I will say, this final step of the arc, most of this arc is directly about abolitionists. We are directly looking at how he reacts to the abolitionist movement. And the last step of the arc is not directly related to the abolitionist movement. It's related to the metaphor of dragons as needing abolition. And that doesn't feel jumpy, and it sort of should, because these are two different, like, you know, motivations, but at the same time, they sort of aren't. Because objectively, the dragons have been used as a metaphor for oppressed people throughout the entire book. So it sort of works that the last step of the arc is, you know, as if it's a different surface. Everything else up till now has been brick, and now we're stepping onto tile. But it still is the same arc, so it still works. It doesn't feel jumpy. The point is, Lawrence definitely makes a progression in how much he's willing to fight for others' rights. But even before we get to the progression, I love the way that Lawrence's perspective is presented when it comes to the enslaved people, and yes, the dragons as well. The book is very clearly in Lawrence's perspective. Like, this is not a, like, separate POV. This is definitely his POV. And so we know that character descriptions are how he sees people. And Lawrence sees the Africans that he meets as human. He doesn't assume they're savage or stupid or barbaric. Even when they are his enemies, he sees them as, like, you know, the same perspective he sees the French. He is willing to trust them, to learn about their culture and beliefs, and assume that they will be logical if he can just manage to explain to them his perspective, which is hard because they speak a different language. But the point is that Lawrence sees people as, all the people as human, and yes, that does extend to the dragons too a bit as well. And the author, Naomi Novik, doesn't feel the need to rub this in our face by having someone say this. We get to just see the other characters not treating them and not seeing people this way. Especially when it comes to the Africans, we see other characters who are degrading them, dismissing them, and just generally not treating them like they're humans. And one of those biggest character contrasts is Riley. So it was set up in the previous book that Riley, who, you know, was Lawrence's friend, he was his subordinate when they were on a ship together, and now he's a captain and they're good mates. Except the previous book, it was set up that Riley's family owns plantations. He comes from enslaver families, and the rare occasion that enslavement has come up between the two, Riley has pushed back hard against Lawrence's belief in abolition. And, like, we get the impression that it's more that Riley is embarrassed about this than that he actively sees what his family is doing is right. And he's just, you know, doing the, like, why are you attacking my family kind of thing. But the point is, they spent a good portion of the last book at odds and not being friendly towards each other because of the question of enslavement. But Lawrence still likes him and clearly wants to maintain a friendship. And that's a sort of hard thing to understand for a modern reader, but at the same time it's also intensely familiar. So, yeah, Riley is pro-slavery, and Lawrence still wants to treat this as like a political disagreement, which is eerily similar to some of the arguments I've seen, especially on left-wing and especially liberal spaces online. Like, there is a continuing argument of where do you draw the line with who you're willing to be friends with? Like, everyone agrees that we should be friends with people who we do not necessarily agree every single 100% politically with. But there does reach a point that it stops being about politics and starts just being a moral question. And where do you draw that line? And a lot of people draw that line in very different places. And so this book, there are actually two different characters that Lawrence respects, even though they are anti-abolition. One is Riley, and the other is Lord Nelson. And by the end of the book, Lawrence no longer respects Lord Nelson. Like, it's clear he does not like the man anymore. And that's because Lord Nelson has made it abundantly clear how willing he is to accept the humanity of others. But Riley, he still wants to be friends with. And I think that's because, and it's not just think, I know it's because Riley makes an offer when they're sailing back to not stop at an enslavement port. And Lawrence takes that as a sign that Riley is willing to at least treat his feelings with delicacy and maybe even listen to what Lawrence is saying. And would that be enough for me? I don't think so. But I'm also not a man in the 1800s, so it's really hard to tell. But the point is, this is a question that is still super relevant and super argued, and I'm really impressed that Naomi Novik managed to tackle it in a book about dragons. The other thing I really want to talk about here is the Swana. And yes, I'm probably mispronouncing that. I'm not good at pronouncing anything, but I know very little about African history. The joys of American education system. I learned, like, nothing about Africa. We basically treated it like it was a country in world history, and the only time we talked about Africa in world history classes was as the victim of the enslavement trade. So, now I will say, I have, after my school career, gone out and like watched YouTube videos, read educational material. Like, I've learned more about Africa than I knew from high school, but still, objectively, I know very little. I know there were some amazing kingdoms and even empires in Africa before colonialization, but I'm not an expert here. And I love the fact that this book features an African nation that is powerful enough to kick the English's ass. Because that is so contrary to any image I have from the education that I grew up in. It also led down a really fun research tunnel. Like, I actually stopped to look up, like, was Cape Town ever invaded by African nations? Who are the Swana people? Like, do they really exist? And I was super embarrassed when I realized that, of course, they really exist. They are the people of Botswana. That makes sense. It's in the damn name. And as far as I can figure out, like, with my lacking knowledge and mediocre research skills, another joy of the American education system. But this seems to be the book where we deviate from what is just basically history with dragons. And I sort of love it. Because, yeah, I feel like adding dragons really evens the playing field when it comes to weaponry between Africans and Europeans. And I'm sort of hoping we continue this path of alternate history that is a bit further from reality, because ultimately, that's the joy of fantasy. The fact that we can imagine a world that is different from our own. You'll notice that even in grimdark fantasy, even if the world is super dark, fantasy is a genre that gives characters power. That is sort of the core of it. And that's why, like, yeah, a lot of fantasy does stumble into wish fulfillment for teenage boys. But the thing that this does across the entire genre of fantasy is it empowers the reader. If you say often enough, imagine a world where you can have the power to be a hero, eventually those readers will start to think, maybe I can have that power. Maybe it's worth it to, like, imagine that I have that power in this world. Maybe it's worth it to try to fight to be a hero. and it can encourage people to, like, actively try to make the world a better place. And in this case, seeing Lawrence graduate from a passive believer in abolition to an actual abolitionist also gives us the encouragement that we all need to move from passively seeing what is wrong to actively working to make the world better. And that's also why I want the books to go further off the rails from real history from here. Because we need to see Lawrence and Temeraire have a real effect on the world. Which, if the history in the books perfectly mirrors the history in our world, if we know that the story would have been the same with or without them, they don't have power. So the history needs to deviate from real history in order to change that. And there's one other thing I want to talk about here. I mentioned in some of the other reviews that the little in-world academic writing that appears in the back of each book is sometimes a bit hard to get through. And I think it should be. Like, I like the fact that some of them are really, like, accurate in the worst ways. Like, they're a little bit arrogant, they're a little bit trying, they're a little bit dehumanizing to whatever they're writing about. And this one was exceptionally hard to get through, but for completely different reasons. The text of this one was actually far easier to read than any of the others. Like, it was not written as arrogantly, it wasn't egregiously wrong-headed. No, this time it would have been super fun to read and really interesting material and stuff that I really wanted to know if it weren't at the end of this book. Because by the end of this book, I was in tears. I was really emotional. This is a really, like, it's a really strong, emotive ending. Like, a lot is happening here. And then suddenly we switch to a relatively dry history of the Swana people and their dragons. And I'm like, are you trying to kill me? Like, I am not in the mood for this anymore. And I think Naomi Novik sort of knew that this was going to be too much of a tonal shift, because this is the shortest of them, I think. Like, this was only 3 pages of history. And objectively, it's history that I really wanted, and I'm not sure where else it would have fit in the book. So I'm glad it's there, I just am not glad where it appears. Like, I feel like maybe that should have been somewhere else in, like, the collection of books. But overall, I'm still loving these books. I feel like this one was a lot more cohesive as an overall book. Like, the last 2 had sort of the vibes of just, like, a series of events, but this one feels a lot more cohesive across the whole. We're watching the character arcs across the whole. The thematic elements are perfectly timed with each other, and some of the shit that felt really random in the previous books makes sense now because it was important to this one. But I will say also, I meant to read just a few pages and then get busy on something else, and no, I just spent the last 2 days doing pretty much nothing but reading this book. So yeah, still loving it. Also, this is one of the books that I feel like is somehow more relevant now than when it was written. So yeah, definitely read the Temeraire series. It's really good.